Good morning. I've been a frequent visitor now to your club and to this institute. I'm a bit disappointed that you didn't mention that I was a global advisor of President Lee. You forgot that. And I thought you forgot because you really don't know what it is about. And I'm in the same situation. I don't know exactly what it is about, but I'm very proud of it because President Lee Myung-bak told me that so far he has only 2 global advisors, Bill Gates and myself. So I've decided to make a phone call to Bill Gates and ask Bill, what does it mean to be the global advisor of the South Korean president? So until we find out, this morning, as you say, we have selected together quite a provocative title, but it's a way to try to catch an overview of the present situation in South Korea. As you mentioned in your introduction, it's nearly impossible to talk about the present situation without any mention on the financial global turmoil which has started in the United States. We are in a very particular position. This global turmoil, this US-started turmoil will have a global impact, but it's extremely difficult to know how far and for how long. You have the pessimistic view and the optimistic view and the in-between. I would put myself in between. It is a serious crisis, but it is not a crisis of the capitalist system. It is not a crisis of the US economy. One of the paradoxes of the crisis, as you know, is that the US economy is still growing. It is still growing. Why? Because the level of innovation and exportation out of the United States is extremely high, not only because the US dollar is cheap, but because the United States remain the unchallenged leaders in terms of innovation. So innovation is the real engine of US economic leadership, and this is not impacted by the financial crisis. The financial crisis itself, in a way, is also kind of a crisis within the system which has to do with innovation. The subprime and the derivatives are innovations. They are really new inventions coming from the financial systems. I do consider that these innovations are useful. They are useful because they spread the risks and they allow the financial system to support new companies all over the world which could not have been financed without the derivatives. Therefore, there is a tendency today to oppose good capitalism, which would be the industrial capitalism creating, real goods, as opposed to bad capitalism, which would be the financial capitalism. Actually, the destiny of both is interconnected. And if we look at the development since 10 years, which has been roughly 5% globally, you cannot explain this 5% growth since 5 years if you do not take into consideration the fact that new financial instruments, starting with the derivatives, have permitted to finance this 5% growth. What went wrong? 2 things. First, like any new innovation, it has to be tried, and when you try it, you make some mistakes, and then you have to correct the mistakes. This is not new. This is typical of any kind of innovation. Therefore, in the future, derivatives will stay with us. They will still be useful, but the risk assessment certainly will be improved. You cannot avoid that in the first sequence, there will be a tendency for over-regulation, which will limit the scope of derivatives. This will probably provoke a credit crunch with negative consequences on the US economy and on the rest of the world. Therefore, you cannot avoid the fact that the global economic growth will slow down starting in the United States next year, and that the slowdown of the US economy will have consequences all over the world, including South Korea. So the situation in the three coming years is not a very good situation as far as the global growth is concerned. There is no reason to think that there will be a recession because once again the fundamentals of the US economy are good and the essential fundamental, the seminal fundamental is innovation, and never in its history the US economy has been more innovative than it is now. But it will take some years to put things together. Therefore, South Korea will have to work in a global environment which is not the best and certainly not the environment which was hoped for by the new president when he was elected. It's not easy to increase the growth rate of your country when the global economy is going south. And it is the same in Europe and especially in the case of France. But as you justly said in your introduction, maybe South Korea will not reach the figures which we are hoped for, but it is still possible to increase the competitive advantage of South Korea. As you know better than I do, South Korea recently has lost some of its economic comparative advantage. Why is that? You have international reasons, of course, the competition of China and other cheap labor countries, which have been able, very frequently by sheer imitation, to price out South Korean industries and South Korean products. And with India rising, Malaysia and other similar countries, South Korean industry will be more and more outpriced out of the market if they don't improve the quality, the innovation, and the brand attraction of what they propose to the world. There is another reason why South Korea's advantage is eroding. It has to do with the labor market. The South Korean labor market is extremely rigid. The wages are relatively high. But I think that rigidity, the lack of flexibility of the labor market, may be a major obstacle, even more an obstacle than the level of wages itself. It is well known that for many foreign companies who would like to invest in South Korea, they are a little bit discouraged, not by the level of the wages, but by the complexity of the labor market regulation, the difficulty to negotiate with the trade unions, and a big uncertainty when you want to discharge workers. You really don't know in advance whenever it will be possible and at what price. So the labor market, maybe more than the wages level, has been an obstacle eroding the comparative advantage of South Korea. Now let's have a look at what the government strategy is. Right this morning, I was reading an article in the Wall Street Journal, a very small article saying investment in South Korea to seek rise in export employment. The South Korean government has identified 22 new growth sectors in which it aims to invest a total of 99 trillion in 5 years to boost exports and employment. The government will inject 8 trillion won, the Ministry of Knowledge Economy said. Its goal is to attract 91 trillion from the private sector. The plan will start next year. The sectors identified account today for 27% of total exports now. They will contribute as much as 77% in 2018, the government forecast. Now, I don't know if the government is surrounded with good economists. I'm sure it is. My good friend Il Sakong is there in charge. But I think that they must employ some other kind of people. The people you call shaman in the Korean tradition. Shaman. Yes. Shaman.
You mean religion?
Yes.
Maybe a shamanism.
Yes. Yes. I'm talking about shamanism. Because I know no government today who will dare to say that in 2018, the government, the Korean economy will be able in this new sector to export 77% of its production.
In 10 years?
Yeah, in 10 years. So I think this is something in between economics and shamanism. But to be more serious, but I am dead serious, this shows two things. First, that there is something very specific about the South Korean culture, which is very much targeted and focused toward the future. Every time I come to Korea, I'm always asked to talk about the future. I'm not very good at that. I mean, I can describe reality, but to talk about the future is extremely difficult, and also it's easy because nobody there to check. I mean, afterwards, in 10 years, everybody will have forgotten about this small article in the Wall Street Journal, okay? But also, I think, which is a characteristic of South Korea, and also a characteristic of France, is that we think then we can pick the winners. And that if you put together a commission of enlightened experts, they will be able to say, these will be the winners of tomorrow, and if we invest enough money, public money and private money in this sector, we will be successful. This has been done by South Korea in the 70s and in the 80s. You have picked the winners: shipbuilding, car building, construction, and so on. And you have been successful, okay? France, in a certain way, did the same. At the same period, we also picked the winner, like nuclear energy, transportation, car industry, plane industry. And sometimes we pick the winners, sometimes we also pick the losers. The problem with this kind of policy is that you never know. You never know. My reluctance toward this kind of strategy is that we live in a world which is no more the world of the 1960s and 70s. It's a world where you have many more players. It's a world where you have much more competition. And it's a world where you have much more innovation. We had in France a couple of months ago a kind of a strategic committee where some economists and wise people were asked by the government also to pick the winners of the future. Some proposals have been made, like green energy, fashionable things, same that you have in your list. But I say to the members of this committee, if this committee existed 20 or 20 years ago, would you have invented Microsoft? Would you have invented Google? Would you have invented fuel cell technology? Certainly not, because this did not exist. So I'm not absolutely sure that the kind of strategy which you put together clever people, and these clever people will design the future. Maybe it will work, maybe it will not work. I think there is an underestimation of the acceleration in the rhythm of innovation. We don't know what the leading factories, companies, innovation, consumer products will be in 10 years and 20 years from now. So I don't say that this strategy is wrong. I just say that this strategy will not work like it used to work in the 20s. It is not the same world once again because of globalization and innovation. However, let us start from the government proposal. Let us imagine that the government has to invest in a series of new sectors. The list has been given here and there. And I was wondering, and I'm wondering with you today, what are the conditions for South Korea to be able to reach these kind of goals? And I'm not sure that the right conditions today exist, or at least I think they must be improved. I will quote some of them, which seems to me the precondition to achieve any growth strategy in South Korea. First of all, you need to have the right people. Do you have the right people? Well, in South Korea you have a lot of educated people. You have even too many of them. I mean by that a large number of college-educated South Koreans do not find a job which is adapted to the kind of education they have received. The mismatch between the education, higher education in South Korea and what the economy requires is increasing year by year. This is a very dangerous situation. You create a lot of frustrated people on one side, and on the other side, the business community do not find the people they need. Many of these young educated people would go and work abroad, but the brain drain is an individual answer for them. It is not a collective answer for the country. So why this inadaptation of higher education and the South Korean economy? I think it has to do with the structure of the South Korean economy, which is dominated by very large company and by heavy industry. Many people in between the very small business and the very large company do not find a space to express themselves, a space for their creativity. Therefore, there cannot be any long-run strategy to diversify and develop the South Korean economy if you don't have a long-term strategy to change in depth the kind of education which is given to the South Korean boys and girls at the college and university level. When I say the kind of education, as you all know, as we all know, education in South Korea requires a lot of work. You have to learn a lot, but you don't learn how to be creative. So what I would criticize in the case of South Korea is not the content of education, but the style of education. The kind of relationship that the teachers have with the students and the absence of effort to increase the creativity of the student. Oh, I'll go back to shamanism in a while. So the reform of the education is a priority. How do you reform education? Very simple, by competition. I think it is the only way, if you look at other countries where education is more creative, like the UK, for example, or Australia, or Hong Kong, or the United States, of course, it is by the competition between private and public sector, or within the public sector, that you can go and have a more creative education. But as long this is not really taken into consideration, I think no industrial strategy has a lot of meaning. There is a second problem with which you will have to cope, and it is related. The second problem is the women participation in the workforce. I mean, the workforce in the South Korea is threatened by an aging population. The people in South Korea are getting older and older. Therefore, you have a restriction in the workforce. The demography is working against growth. This is very similar to Japan. You are not yet into the Japanese situation, but you are getting close to the Japanese situation. Therefore, and it's not a contradiction with the unemployment, you have to increase the number of workers and you have to increase the number of working hours. There is, and I won't go into details, there is a direct connection between the number of worked hours and the economic growth of a country. In Japan, it's because people work less people work less, therefore you have a decline. In France, less people work less, therefore we have a decline. In the United States, more people work more, and you have a high growth rate. So one of the problems of South Korea, if you want to implement your development strategy, is to increase the workforce. This can be done two ways. First, by increasing female participation. Gender discrimination should be considered, and part-time workers should be better respected. I think the participation of the women should increase by 1 or 2% a year if you want to stabilize the working force in South Korea. If not, you will rely more and more on immigration, which is a solution, but which is also a source of problem. Immigration, you cannot avoid it. You will have to import more and more skilled people. Why? Because when you look at innovation in the modern world, it always requires a confrontation between cultures. If you go and see and visit companies in the United States like IBM or Google, or Microsoft, which will strike you. All the people on earth are represented. It's like the United Nations. Why is it? It's because the leader at Google, IBM or Microsoft or other company consider that today you can solve a problem only by employing people coming from all cultures so that they will tackle with the problem from a different mindset. And that innovation today can happen only in a country which is open to this import of different mindset. You cannot solve problems and you cannot be an innovative country if you remain between yourself, because you will tackle with the problem only from one cultural perspective. Therefore, if you want to be innovative, you must be much more open to skilled people. It should start at the college level. This means, and I won't get into details, I did that in other circumstances, attract foreign students, attract foreign professors in order to build a multicultural task force and working force if you want to become an innovative country. Also, and I've dealt many times with this, and I will repeat myself, and sorry for that. One of the weaknesses of South Korea, or relative weakness of South Korea, is the weakness of South Korea as a brand. I talk very often about this. Very few people know where South Korea is. Many French consumers buy a Samsung telephone thinking that Samsung is a Japanese company, and South Korea doesn't sell. So you could say, well, it doesn't matter as long as they buy Hyundai or Samsung or else. It does matter. It does matter. Because you don't sell at the same price and you don't create the same kind of connection with the consumer if there is not this kind of cultural recognition between the consumer and the producer. Therefore, I very often mention the fact that South Korea having a rather low recognition in terms of brand as compared to France, Germany, United States and Japan, this is a weakness for the South Korean economy. This could be easily repaired. I think that if South Korea, and I say that to the President, if South Korea was taking this problem into consideration, you should very easily find a public relation or advertisement agency somewhere in the world, anywhere, and promote South Korea as a brand. This has been done systematically by the Japanese government since 50 years. And if people love to buy Japanese products, it is also because Japan systematically has a policy of promoting Japan as a brand. It has never been done in South Korea, and I still do not understand why. And once again, it would not be that difficult. There are sufficient elements in the South Korean civilization so that it could be positively promoted as a brand. Another remark, and in this new strategy for South Korea, it's also related to Korea as a brand. South Korea's government still in the 1960 model is still very much concerned primarily by heavy industry, tradition of heavy industry. The service sector in this strategy, the service sector is systematically underestimated, as if the service sector was not as noble as the industry. I think this is a big mistake. The service sector in the modern world, be it the financial sector or be it the tourist industry, they are as noble, as profitable, and they provide more employment and qualified employment than many industries. Therefore, I think we should very much insist on the fact that there are untapped resources in South Korea, in the service industry, and the tourist industry mostly, untapped, which should be part of the strategy belonging to the government. Now, I don't want to talk too long, but I will make, before question and answers, a final observations. Yesterday, I was invited to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Korean Labor Institute. So we talked a lot about labor market flexibility, and all the scholars who were there, business people who were there, all agreed that labor flexibility and getting rid of certain laws which have been written in the 1960s was absolutely essential to bring back some dynamism in the industrialization of the country, and also, as I said before, to attract foreign investors which are appalled by the rigidity of this labor law. So it was a happy day because there was a consensus. But then I decided to break the consensus in saying what? In saying, well, in social affairs, it's like in economy. To have brilliant ideas, it's very easy. You can say the future is for alternative energy. Everybody will applaud. The future is fuel cells. The future is nanotechnology. And in labor market, the future is labor market flexibility. So there is a consensus on ideas. But life doesn't work like that. You need to sell these ideas to the people. Therefore, you can have the best ideas of the world expressed by the best expert. But if you are unable to convince the people, to convince the public opinion that those are the right ideas, and those are not ideas which come from the top and which are imposed on the people, if you are not able to convince, to explain, and to negotiate, you can have the best ideas, but these ideas will be never achieved. So I think, as a general observation, when you talk about economic strategy or social strategy, and once again labor market flexibility being one of the key elements of this strategy, if a government is not skillful enough to explain, convince, and negotiate, is not doomed to success, is doomed to failure. Once again, in a democracy, in a good idea, a fair idea, a promising idea is an idea which is accepted and understood by the people. Thank you. So I've been saying, okay, shamanism is not relevant. What do you mean by that? Nobody understood when I was talking about shamanism? Yeah, it's clear, isn't it? No? Yeah?
Wishful thinking.
Yeah, kind of. No, well, the false god, maybe praying the good gods. Okay, yeah, okay. So McKinsey is the good god and the plural.
I think now you are all convinced that Professor Sorman is not only a great scholar and a thinker, but also he's a very great communicator. He just draws attracts attention of the audiences. Thank you very much for your very, in a sense, a little bit sense of provocation and very deep insight. Before taking questions from the floor, I'd like to take a privilege of being a reporter this morning, which is that, as he mentioned in his presentation, the Korean government just yesterday announced, in Korean, it is 신성장 동력 산업, new growth sources for future Korean economic growth. And personally, I studied a lot about Korea's industrial policy in the past. During my career. And then I think there are several differences between what Korea has pursued in 1970s, 80s for our heavy and chemical industries, and the future-oriented plan which was just announced yesterday. One difference is that the heavy and industry promotion policy was initiated and led by the government. It was purely government-led initiation. But as far as I understand, yesterday's the picture, the master plan was drawn by the experts from the private sector, both from the industry and both from the academia. Government was just sitting aside. And then another difference is that in the 70s, the government mobilized the huge amount of the financial resources and also mobilized the tax incentives and other incentives to concentrate investment into those industries which were picked by the government. But nowadays, government has very little tools. In the first place, by the international trading rules, WTO principle, government cannot mobilize the subsidies to particular industries. It is prohibited. And the second place, I think government already know that it is not the good policy, to change the flow of resources into particular industries. It is wholly up to the private sector decision making. So the whole purpose of the master plan this time is to provide information to private entrepreneurs because they still do not know well about what will be the promising sectors in the future. So the whole purpose is to provide information. And even when government provides some incentive tools, I think it is mostly in the areas of research and development, technological development. That's my understanding. Yeah. So we should know clearly the difference between the picking the winner policy in the 70s and the master plan announced yesterday. It is my personal opinion. Of course, we can discuss on that later. Yeah. Then, having said that, now I'd like to take questions from the floor. Please.
The unprecedented, as Dr. Lee summarized at the outset of this morning's session, the unprecedented level of crisis is daunting upon us, the people of this globe. I mean, a lot of people are in full agreement. But when you said you're 50-50 kind of in between of optimism and pessimism, I was also impressed about your optimism. Because of the innovation and creativity, the United States should be able to regain growth in a few years. I think that's a summation of your neutral forecast. But then I remember a lot of leading economists and Wall Street in London who estimate the total magnitude of the non-performing assets to the tune of between $2 and $3 trillion. And the United States has set aside $400 billion plus the $700 billion to come up now is slightly over about $1 trillion now to tackle the magnitude of let's say about $2.5 trillion. And then the Main Street, the economy, the Main Street, like the companies in Detroit, GM and Chrysler, Ford, even they are asking for taxpayers' money, assistance from the government for them to survive. And the total debt of the government, the U.S. government, is now exceeding their GDP with this new package. And my question is, do you think the United States should continue to enjoy the seniority advantage, meaning that over time, say, in the global inflationary environment, the real burden on the part of the U.S. government should go down, in order to decrease in terms of real burden, thanks to inflation. Yeah. Then, is this going to continue? Not this. I personally believe the United States will regain growth. I'm in agreement with you, and because many past crises the U.S. Ditched and they came back, and this time I think the U.S. will gain back because a lot of foreign companies, foreign investors would like to seek distressed assets in the United States. A lot of money, capital will go into the United States throughout next year, and then the more immigrants to the United States, more brains and more capital will go into the United States. In other words, money, capital without any interest payment on the United States government. So U.S. will come back, but then come. My question is, should given this century, 21st century, would the whole people in the world continue to face hostage to the monopower?
We are reciprocally hostage. And if you take Japan or China or even Russia, I mean the countries which have a lot of reserves, I mean as you know, they buy U.S. Treasury bills as mad as they never did before. So who is the hostage? Is China, Russia, Japan the hostage, or the United States? We don't know. It's a system of interdependence. There is a consensus right now, I don't say it's good or bad, but there is a consensus that if the United States is in trouble, we'll all be in even more severe trouble. And therefore, all central banks and governments have taken as a position to support the United States, its endeavor to finance the crisis. And why is that? Of course, because it is a leading economy, but also because, in spite of everything what happened in the United States, still there is nothing safer than a U.S. Treasury bond. And it's because it is the safest investment that people right now, in a crisis, are ready to buy U.S. Treasury bonds, which brings no interest at all. So they just buy the safety. They just buy the safety. And another remark is that, regretfully, there is no alternative. And no alternative. I mean, there was a hope some years ago, and maybe it will happen someday, that the Eurozone could be an alternative. But this requires time. Because to be an alternative, you must prove through many crises that you are able to survive the crisis and that the money remains untouched. So far, it is not the case. The Eurozone is rather small, it's a short history, and there is no consensus in Europe on what the targets of the European Central Bank should be. Therefore, it's not because people love the United States, it's because the Treasury bills are safe and because there is no alternative where to put your money. And once again, I think that, repeat myself very shortly, that beyond the financial crisis and the disastrous way it has been managed by funds and banks, the leadership of the United States really comes from their universities and capacity for innovation, very strong relationship between academics and the business community. So if we were, in the case of South Korea, but also in the case of France, if we were to learn something from the United States leadership in terms of innovation, we should try to have universities at least as good as the American universities and try to build a kind of relationship between business and academics, which is the real strength of America. And this is what we should look at, and this is why so many French students and South Korean students go to American universities. It's because of the quality of this education system and because of the excellent connection with the private sector. This is the real strength of the country, I think. And I wanted to show, it's not very easy, so because it's very small and I'm not, but I was reading these days a study by the RAND Corporation on innovation all around the world. Which are the most innovative countries? And how do you measure innovation? And on this map, on this graph, you see, so it's a number of patents, okay? The number of patents which are issued each year by a group of countries. The United States comes first with 38,000 what's called triadic patents. That's patents which really are applied, okay, not theoretical patents. 38,000, which is absolutely remarkable with the increase of the number of patents. When people talk about the decline of the United States from 1985 until that's 2007, the number of patents has doubled in the United States. It has also doubled in the European Union. European Union comes second. So United States 38, European Union 31. Japan is doing very well. Japan has nearly doubled also its number of patents in 10 years. 26, not far behind if you consider the size of the population. Then you have a big hole, and in the hole, in the desert, you have two big countries, Russia, China. Russia and China are producing no innovation, no patents. And suddenly you have this hill, appearing on the right side, South Korea. South Korea, with 2,000 patents in year 2007, doubled in 10 years. So this is very interesting because if you take into consideration the size of the population and level of development, okay, you have the three leaders. United States, far ahead. Europe doing pretty well. Japan doing very well instead of its economic stagnation. And then the only country which does appear, and once again you have to relate that to this rather small demography, is South Korea. And I think this is it came as a surprise for me, and I think it's extremely significant of the real strength of the South Korean economy. It really comes from innovation. So any strategy which will increase the connection between universities and the business community will increase this figure. And as I said before, to increase even more you must internationalize your research system. I mean, the research centers and academic centers, universities in South Korea are still very much closed, parochial. They are in Japan to a certain extent, but less. You have the chance to have thousands of South Korean students abroad, and this kind of network, which brings innovation, shouldn't be located only in South Korea. You have to think in terms of network, including in the network all the South Korean students who are studying and working abroad. So this comes from the RAND Corporation, and it's very easy to find, and I think it's very clear, but it's even nicer in color.
Thank you very much. Actually, this year marks the 10th anniversary of the birth of Europe.
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
Yes. And next month, the big international conference will be held in Washington, D.C., the center of the U.S. economy. Maybe New York is the center, but it's losing its sentence, I'm afraid. Anyway, so they will discuss about whether what is the chance for Europe for replacing, either partly or wholly the U.S. dollar. Yeah. Thank you very much.
I comment. I don't think the ambition is to replace, but I think that the world should have a choice.
Yes.
And because what's bad about the U.S. dollar? It is a monopoly. So any monopoly is bad. It's bad, not efficient. Okay. Because when you have a monopoly, it means that you can make a mistake without control. So the purpose of the euro is not to replace, but because you would have another monopoly, but is to have the choice so that currencies would be better managed. And if we look at the economic progress since 10 or 15 years, one of the remarkable achievements in the global economy is that hyperinflation has disappeared nearly everywhere. Now you have only 2 or 3 countries in the world which have a double-digit inflation, in countries like Zimbabwe or like Argentina. But in most of the countries, the inflation is under control. Why? Because you have competition between currencies and you have independent central bank. And one of the challenges for South Korea is to have a stable and predictable currency, which is not the case right now. So we mentioned, some conditions to be taken into consideration to implement the kind of strategy that we both described. And but among the conditions, if you want to attract investment, the business people need to have a long-term perspective. And to have a long-term perspective, you better know what currency you use. And many people, it's been talked a lot, can the euro model be applied in Asia? Well, it could work between, I would say, Korea and Japan. But as long China is an unpredictable regime, there is no way to have an Asian currency. But once again, I want to elaborate on that. This currency predictability is one of the strong elements also if you want to have a long-run development strategy.
You mentioned about the labor rigidity and rigidity of labor regulations hampering Korean economic competitiveness. But I want to also mention about and question about this militancy of labor union. Actually, the percentage of unionization of Korea is far less than that of OECD countries. However, this Korean Union is very powerful, especially Korean Union is very powerful in big and strong and profitable companies only. Actually, they're very powerful in steel making, automobile making, and oil refineries, and banks, and shipbuildings, etc. And even some factories, their labor cost is higher than in absolute dollar terms than that of other advanced countries. I think that is why the large companies they do not increase the prices they pay to subcontractors and they are moving their factories overseas, and they are not flexible enough to hire more employees. And partly I think that will cause the spiritual wealth of the country too. I want to hear from you what would be preconditions, social and political preconditions to correct the situations. Thank you.
A very clear-cut solution, I would propose it to the French government, because what you describe is the French situation. And but it's also the case, as you know, in certain sectors in Germany. It has been the case, but it's no more in UK. It is a bit the case in Spain. It's as well in the United States. There is a discrepancy between the weight of the trade union and their power. The numbers, as you say, is very small. It's going down, but still, as there are in key sectors in the industry, in the case of South Korea, in France, it's more in education and transport. They have the capacity to freeze the economic, the social life and the economic system. Therefore, we have to deal with the trade unions, and it's extremely difficult. In the case of South Korea, some remarks, I think, which applies only to South Korea. The unions in South Korea, in the time of the authoritarian military regime, they had kind of a double legitimacy. They were representing the workers, but also they pretended to represent the people at large, and that they were fighting for democracy. So the unions in South Korea are still playing on this kind of nostalgia, pretending that beyond their purely workers' representation, they have kind of a legitimate historical role to play as a permanent defender of a human right and democracy. I think on this, the government, the media, and public intellectuals should be very clear. The legitimacy today belongs to the elected government. It belongs to the government, it belongs to the parliament. I think that any pretense coming from the trade union to represent the people and not only the workers should not be accepted. And this should be said very clearly. It's not that easy, also because democracy is quite recent in South Korea, and people are not yet ready to accept, the change in government. We could see that recently there were huge demonstrations. Some of these demonstrations were motivated maybe by honest feeling, but others were motivated by a desire for political revenge between people who have a standard working contract and people who have a non-standard contract. Okay, you have two kinds of workers in Korea according to the kind of contract they have. So you should clearly say that in a democratic country there should be no legal discrimination. There is only one kind of contract, which is a standard contract. But you can impose a standard contract only if you have some kind of a global safety net. I won't go into detail. It was the debate yesterday at the Korean Labor Institute. There are many proposals on the table, but I think that it's possible in South Korea to build a social safety net, to explain it to the population, and then to little by little reduce the influence of the labor union. This will take time. It is absolutely possible. It is being done in Western Europe. It is being done in France. But it is possible only if the government has a very clear strategy and explains the strategy to the public opinion and uses the public opinion as a support against the lobbying of the trade union. It's easy to describe, more difficult to implement, but if you don't have a strategy, if you don't explain why you go there, that's a bit the problem. Even in France, people need to understand, okay, you are going to reduce my rights. Why do you do that? Why do I get in return? So you need to explain and then to negotiate. To negotiate is something a bit new in South Korea, but it has to be learned.
Thank you very much. Here I have one written question, so let me quickly read this. I'm working on writing texts on Korean palaces and historic sites. What do you mean, Professor Sorman, by storytelling Korea? How can you do that? Is there any article of yours or a book on that?
No, a book on mine, no. And I don't know if it's yet been published. This year is the 60th anniversary of the South Korea Republic. So I've been asked by the Government Information Service to write a long essay telling the story of South Korea the way I perceive it. So this will be published among other foreign authors, I think in the coming days, by the information service of the government, and I think that extract will be also published by the Jonggang Daily. There is also a very remarkable book which has just been published in Korean and in English, which is called the Atlas of South Korean History. So I think there are many sources which are right now available.